والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. Dear Professor AASIM, our professors, doctors, postgraduate student, our participant from Istac here and from other places in Malaysia here, and those who are following us in the Zoom and YouTube channel, welcome to our distinguished lecture. Today, Alhamdulillah, we are very much honored to have with us one of the, I can say, great professors in his own area of specialization and in his work, Professor AASIM ILYAS. He is here with us all the way from USA. He has been here for a few days. He was in Kuantan with our team in the medical faculties, helping us to shape certain ideas and things here, and we invited him today, and we are very much honored that he find time to be with us to address us on a very important topic of interest, not only to biomedical people or to scholars and researchers, but to every human being actually. Because anything, the concept of health and well-being from an Islamic perspective is the essence of every human. And from there starts the building of any type of knowledge. We are all revolving around the idea of getting health. But the difference is what health you are looking for. Whether the physical or the ruh or the moral, that one I think our professor today will be helping us to see these things. The topic of our professor today is the challenges of establishing Islamic bioethics in the face of advancing modern biosciences. It's really a timely and a very important topic to all of us, brothers and sisters. Once again, I welcome Professor AASIM to Istac this morning. And I welcome all our professors, Prof. Osman, Prof. Khalid, Prof. Murad, all the professors and doctors and brothers and sisters to the session today. I would like also to thank the loyal participants who are always with us in the Zoom and in the YouTube from many countries following Istac programs. With this, I pass the mic to Dr. Ayn, who is our moderator today. Go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you everyone for coming and welcome to Istac-Iium Distinguished Scholar Lecture. And this is our number four lecture series for today. And we bring you today Dr. AASIM PADELA from Medical College of Wisconsin. And he's a professor of emergency medicine and also bioethics and medical humanities. So he has been an emergency medicine and bioethics and medical humanities professor at the Medical College of Wisconsin, USA since 2020. Is that right? And he is also currently the co-director of the Community Engagement Core Comprehensive Injury Center, co-investigator of the Center for Advancing Population Science, and the associate investigator of the Cancer Center of Medical College, Wisconsin. He has been working to integrate the medical field with religion and Islam for many years, and he has held many positions related to the subject, such as the director of the Medicine and Religion program at the University of Chicago, visiting scholar at IIIT Virginia, an affiliate of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, University of Chicago, and the director of the Initiative on Medicine and Islam program on Medicine and Religion, University of Chicago. So here we have his, he has an extensive CV of 58 pages, minus 157. And yeah, without further ado, I think we should let him present, inshallah. The floor is yours.
الله خير. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. اللهم علمنا بما ينفعنا وينفعنا بما تعلمنا وزدنا بفضلك علما وتعليما إنك على كل شيء قدير. Alhamdulillah, it is really a pleasure to be here at Istac, a place that I have a vision in my mind many years, for many years as a student, thinking about the great work, the great individuals, the great personalities, the great aspirations that have come out of this place. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed me to be amongst this esteemed group today and our colleagues online to be here. So it's really my honor and my pleasure. Thank you, Professor Aziz and Professor Abdul Razak Hashi, Professor Swan Bakar, and others for allowing me to join you for this morning. I will give you a little bit of this talk. The title was not mine. It was from a colleague of mine about the challenges of establishing Islamic bioethics. I, inshallah, hope to engage you in a little bit more storytelling. But since this is an academic institution, we will have a lecture, we will have some conversation thereafter, and I do hope to share with you some anecdotes. To give you a sense of where I'm going to venture in this conversation, I want to take us back to give you a better sense of what I do, who I am. So my research involves multiple methods, empirical, textual, and theological, but I think there are three central characters, I would say, that I study and in different registers to bring together the Islamic tradition, biomedicine, and Muslim practices. So I investigate, and my team investigates, how Islam influences the behaviors of Muslim patients, right, and the decisions that they make when they encounter healthcare challenges. We study how Islam informs the bioethical attitudes of Muslim physicians globally, right, and how their identity as Muslim, particularly in a diasporic context, can create some sort of challenges within their practice. And then I investigate how Islam as a tradition is used by ulama and fuqaha and commentators to produce moral guidance for how we engage with contemporary biomedicine. So I said that work is multi-interdisciplinary and brings together empirical, textual, and theological methods. The goal of that, however, is not just description, right, but rather to create interventions, right? So we move from Muslim behavior and practices to interventions within multiple spaces, including within the Muslim community, that we more faithfully engage with contemporary biomedicine, drawing upon our tradition, but also in recognizing our identity, right? Our intersectional identity. That we inform and engage and create interventions within the healthcare system at large. How do we treat the religious dimension of health, as Professor Aziz was saying, right? That is not just a physical condition, but rather a whole being that is coming to get care. And how do we do so? From an Islamic perspective, yes, but also how Muslims within that sphere are attended to. So we create interventions and policy around that domain. And then we think about largely the academy, right? That studies this direction. How do we create interventions in the academy? So that's the research work, but my own lived experience is in several registers at this intersection as well. And again, I'm giving you these preliminaries so that when I comment and when we have conversation, you can feel free to inquire, but you also get a sense of how I am entering into this, right, conversation, into this dialogue. So for me, I spend some time on clinical ethics committees, right? Particularly in this case, obviously I live in the United States, but I also do some consultation outside the United States, so predominantly in a minority context, where Muslim practices and how biomedicine is delivered can be in conflict at times, presenting ethical challenges. I'm a trained bioethicist. I did a fellowship in clinical medical ethics. And so we want to adjudicate those conflicts, right, between patient values and healthcare system values and culture. I spend time as a bioethics teacher and ethics consultant in the Muslim community itself, right? As many Muslim physicians around the world can attest to, that when you enter the masjid, people ask you many things, whether or not you're trained in anything, but they want to know, what does Islam have to say, or what do Muslims have to say, or they want a second opinion from a Muslim doctor, believing, perhaps rightfully, perhaps wrongfully, that just being a Muslim physician gives you some extra insight into how to again, use medicine in a more faithful way. I spent time as a policy consultant for international and local in the United States institutions, thinking about how to develop policies that attend to moral plurality. And this should be something that's really important in Malaysia in this context, as well as a plural society, where Muslim majority nations sometimes don't have a thinking about plurality in a certain way. And when you're in a minority context, you must. And certain countries are thinking about how to institute policies that engage with the plurality within our tradition, but also across traditions. And then I spent time, as I was sharing with you this morning, Professor Aziz, in multidisciplinary working groups and fiqh councils, trying to better delineate moral guidance to provide to Muslim polities. So that's my roles, right? Not my research, but the roles I inhabit in my daily work, aside from being a doctor in the emergency room, where I spend time taking care of patients. So as I mentioned, I came here initially prepared to have a conversation with some anecdotes that were going to be conversation starters. You see them on the screen. I hope to come back to them after this about 35-minute lecture to share with you synopses of what were challenges, what are challenges, what I faced, to share with you a little bit of a sense for those who are online, who are pursuing, perhaps thinking about pursuing career at this intersection, but for all of you to give me guidance of how I should consider the next part of my career. So the discussion questions for this lecture part are the first, right? We can't talk about challenges of establishing a field without thinking about what it is. So what is Islamic bioethics? And then we can think about where it belongs, and I will intersperse some personal anecdotes to inform my own lens onto these critical questions. So let's start with that, right? Islamic bioethics might seem as two terms, but it's more than two. Yes, you have Islam and you have bioethics, but you have some notion of Islam that you're applying with the IC, right? Islamic. You have to have a stable notion of what that tradition is, and then you're going to apply it to bioethics, yes, which is one term, but it is also broken too. Some notion of the bio, right, and the ethics of the bio, right? So you're bringing together a conglomerate of terms. One can start by thinking about the Islam portion, right? Or one can start with thinking about the bioethics portion. So if you start with thinking about the Islamic portion, the initial question might be, what are the bioethics of Islam? Meaning the grounding might be from the tradition itself. And then that tradition would say, okay, well, if there is such a thing of bioethical sort of frameworks or thinking, what would that look like, right? Your point of departure becomes from the tradition to approach something. But if you start on the other side, you say, well, I want to engage with an established body of bioethics, an established tradition of bioethics, an established cultural dynamic of bioethics. Then we might say, well, we want to apply an Islamic version, right? So you might start with the grounding of this is what's occurring in present day, what a bioethics is, and now I'm going to try to bring together some connection between the tradition of Islam to that world that exists. I'll say that for me, I started with the latter, the bioethics, right? And then how does Islamic version comes in. So I spent time as a young student. I was duly enrolled in a madrasa and a high school in the United States. And I was privileged that my family had ulama, and they were about doing the traditional sciences. I was a rebel in a certain way, as you can imagine, perhaps, and did what some parts of that curriculum, but always said, okay, after I do my secular studies, because we had this sort of not schizophrenic, it's a bad word, I'm a physician, but at least a solid worldview. You have the Islamic sciences and you have the secular sciences. The twain shall never meet. So the idea was, I will go spend some time, right, in the secular world, get my degrees, and come back, and then go back and finish the madrasa education, which I never finished. Perhaps one day Allah will give me the ability and the time and the tawfiq to do that. And I don't dismiss it in any way. But this was the worldview that this was schooled in as a Pakistani, young Pakistani immigrant to the United States. I say that, then later on, when I did that when I was doing the secular degrees, I remember in medical school at Cornell, one of the first classes that we had was a class of bioethics, right? So you learn your anatomy, physiology, but in that first year of training, there is about 4 weeks of module on bioethics, where they go through theories of the 4 principles. You would go through and talk about classical cases that were in the contemporary United States court system were adjudicated, right? And I remember that our professor of that class was very involved with a Jewish community's view on minimal conscious states, right? States that are not quite brain death, that term. If those who know me online, or that term is really problematic, and I don't like to use that term, and I do a lot of work on brain death, but not dead by neurological criteria, minimally conscious. And the Jewish community that he worked with was had very specific views on the value of the human being at that time between death and not death. And so as a Muslim student there were two, I think, maybe one other Muslim student in my class of about 100. And so I guess he thought I was the most practicing of the group and said, well, what does Islam have to say about this? And having inhabited a world where I was doing madrasa studies and not really thinking much about, I did do Arabic and so on, but didn't think the twain shall meet. I actually had no answer. I had no idea. And I didn't think anyone else had an idea either at that time. My point of departure, all that segues to say my point of departure was there was a world of bioethics that exists, continues, disciplines, fields of inquiry. And for me, it became, okay, well, and how do I bring together, how do I think about where Islam would come into this domain? So today, I'm going to give you that journey, although one might argue for another person, if it wasn't me, might have started thinking about from Islam first, right? What would be from a Manzur Islami, what would be the bioethics that we construct up? And I do some of that work, but it wasn't the initial point of my investigation. So fast forwarding many, many years, I want to tell you that this, from that story that I gave you, in 2011, I was privileged to bring together scholars at the University of Michigan, where I was an instructor as well as a research fellow, to have the first conference in the United States that was interdisciplinary on Islamic bioethics and end-of-life care. I've been fascinated with this notion of how we care for the dying, because it reveals what we think of ourselves, right? It reveals what we think of who we are and what rights or duties are owed to those who are going to be in this liminal stage and who are going to be departing this world. I think it reveals much about society and how we care for the elderly, right? And how we think about what is vitality and not. And I think for those who are interested in this domain of intersection of sciences, right? The Islamization project, the notion of what is death is a really important, right? How do you think about, how do you diagnose, how do you determine, define, how do you diagnose in this case, or maybe set criteria for death, and what purposes does it serve? So I was always fascinated by the social, so I was able to have this conference, but what I want to share with you is that one of the clear notions at that day, 2011, right, over a decade ago, we had a panel that was a closed door panel on, is there an Islamic bioethics? The conference attendees had gone away. We had a closed door session, had the conference, had the title, but still was unconcerned about, well, is there such a thing? And then you will notice that at that panel, we had Professor Abdul Sajidina, may Allah bless him, PhD, many of you probably know him. And he was going to be the first individual entering into that conversation. But then we had Tariq Ramadan and Sheikh Musa Ferber, who actually is in Sabra Jaya, as I learned, right, a traditional alim Azhari trained mufti. But again, social scientist, some Islamic studies perspective, right? Tariq Ramadan, so different perspectives on that question. And I'm saying to you now, a decade after, still saying to you, well, is there such a thing? What is Islamic bioethics? Because the question remains. And for a project that, as this center is at the university that it is affiliated with, is around this notion of Islamization. Us, from a position, you sit here in the Malay peninsula, established where Malay means Muslim as an identity. You sit here in a secure place. You gaze upon the world, as this picture here from the university, from the Islamic Museum in Doha, in a Muslim environment and Muslim culture. And you'll gaze upon the technology coming from the West, and you say, okay, what does Islam have to say about it, right? We can Islamize or cannot Islamize the technology, the worldviews that are coming forth, while I sat on the other side as a minority Muslim in the post 9/11 America, right, whose identity was in the crosshairs, thinking about, well, is there such a thing where in Islam we can draw to have a conversation so I can be informed as a practicing physician? For those students of mine, will there be some Islam that they will remain, or will it all be discarded? And the garb, as you put on the white coat, we will now put on the white coat of secular practice, not one that has anything to do with religion, right? And today, 20 plus years hence, that is still the question that students come with. Whether or not when they don the white coat, they discard their jilbab or their niqab. Students today still ask me when I want to interview for a residency position in the United States or Canada, should I take off my niqab and my hijab so that I might get a position? Because they're still seen as the illuminating Western best training programs where we need to go because they don't exist in our own countries. And while we hope to change that, but I tell you the identity crisis remains. That was all preamble to now a formal little descriptive lecture. I'm going to talk about bioethics because that's the field that we have to engage with as an academic field, as a dialogical partner for Islamic discourses. And I'm going to critically analyze Muslim engagement with this field, right? That will then illuminate some of the challenges that we face. I'll have 3 models that I will share with you about engagement with this field, the limitations and implications of each, and the threats I see. And then we're going to consider paths forward for an Islamic bioethics that's rooted, right? That is holistic, that is multidisciplinary at the end. And then we'll have some conversation together. Bidhnillah ta'ala. So bioethics, and this for those who are already in the field, this is all review, but bioethics as a field, modern bioethics, right? We are in modernity. One more aside. So Professor Aziz reminded me of the notion that that we are in a world as Foucault would say, of biopower, that everything in society, the bodies are being adjudicated and transacted, right? We can't escape that. And bioethics as a field has to respond to this dynamic in society, right? So bioethics was formed 50 odd years ago as a modern field, right? With a biolocated birth, with 2 main actors. They talk about Andre Helliger at the Kennedy Institute for Ethics, who thought of the term itself and the field that he was going to help build and seed as the application of moral philosophy to concrete medical problems, right? Medical dilemmas. So it's going to be rooted within the healthcare system, and we're going to be philosophers to engage with it. On the other side, we had Van Potter, right, who was thinking about bioethics not as something located in the healthcare system and not moral philosophers only, but we have to bridge facts and values, right? And in a broader sense, it's about life sciences, but also ecology, about the environment. So at a more expansive view of bioethics, Helliger's largely worn out in how the field has progressed, but nonetheless, there is still an attempt to bring other environmental sciences, for example, into the fold of bioethical thinking. In terms of the levels of analysis of bioethics, this is all, for those in the room, this will all be old hat, but right, we can think about normative ethics, right? What is moral? And so bioethics does that, right? What should I do? Or the meta questions of how ought we reason, right? How do we know what is moral, what is morality? It works at that register as well. There's applied bioethics, right? So these are practical domains of scope. So what issues does the field address? What should we be addressing? For example, should we be thinking about ecology, environmental sciences, and policy work or not? And then descriptive bioethics, right? What people themselves, communities and cultures, how they apply ethics. So all of these sort of registers, and there are other ways to think about this, conceptual, theoretical, and practical ethics being another schema. But I share this is what the work of bioethics is today, right? Normative, meta, applied, and descriptive bioethics. And in centers of bioethics, all of these sorts of inquiries are taking place today. So when the field has professionalized, it became a multidisciplinary field of inquiry with various subfields, right? Because it was expansive in the scope. It includes public health, clinical ethics, environmental ethics, research ethics, all of these subfields. And it uses multiple modes of discovery, right? So we think about normative discovery, the rules and theories, whether we think about legal discovery, right? That's somewhat normative, narrative bioethics, empirical bioethics, that the modern phenomenon of bioethics, the modern field of bioethics, that and Islam is going to engage with, or should be engaging with, has become this very expansive academic field that's professionalized with individuals who are tabbed bioethics. And how did that happen? Yes, centers. So the talk today was titled by Dr. Abdul-Razak Hashi as the challenges for establishing Islamic bioethics. So the establishment of bioethics itself came through centers, right? Like a center for inquiry here, independent think tanks, or centers of bioethics that were established within schools of medicine and universities that would have research programs. They would have degrees, right? They would have master's, doctoral programs, undergraduate programs. That a field was built on the basis of independent research think tanks, as well as academic institutions and degrees. There became books and series of books focusing on the methods and the topics of bioethics, and dedicated journals, right, to produce a discourse, right, on research and applied issues. And ultimately, even professional societies, right? So we have academies here at the International Association of Bioethics, or this American Society itself. So much so that today, at least in the United States, there is an overwhelming push that if you want to be a clinical ethics consultant in the hospital, right? The initial idea of Helliger's was that it would be rooted in healthcare issues, modern or practical healthcare dilemmas. If you want to be able to adjudicate those matters, you need a certification. Some of us, my gray hair, have grandfathered in, but not the new graduates. You need a specific certification so that you can be hired into jobs such as these here as clinical bioethics at these academies. And not only did they set up these positions, right, of clinical bioethicists, we have centers and endowed professorships in the field itself. So that's how, over the last 50 years or so, bioethics as a modern academic enterprise, field of inquiry, discipline, one might say, has been established. Islam, or Muslims, let's say, what has been our, right, engagement with this field? Right? What is the project that we have as a global community? How have we engaged in this dynamic? What I'm going to share with you now are some models for that in the paper that came out with Istac-Iium, our journal from ILYAS here. But I'll share with you some of the models. And again, this is a little bit of a oversimplified caricature. So the model of engagement with this world, now 50 plus years established, of bioethics, from the Muslim lens, I would offer one of the first models of engagement is a visitor model. What I mean by that is that it is reactive to developments from the West. You have some phenomenon that occurs, some technology that comes, some question that arises. That hot topic is then addressed by Islamic jurists, state bodies, or advisory councils, right? Istac-Iium, for example, here, right? Or the Mufti of Egypt, or Dar al-Ifta, right, in Sudan. That you have, or even where you don't have those bodies in the Muslim world, in the United States, by a prominent jurist, right, that's recognized by the community. That this hot topic is addressed in written form or verbally on social media or on a lecture like this, right? That's one aspect of the visitor model, right? It's reactive. And the other way it's reactive is that modern bioethical frameworks, I mentioned at the outset of this talk, the 4-principle method, for example, of bioethics that was put together by Bouchard and Childress to be a transcultural, right, secular framework that is applied globally, universal. That's found by researchers within the Islamic sources, right? So that model of visitation relies upon an external person raising a question to a jurist who then goes and thinks about our sources, canonical sources, right? Quran, Sunnah, Ijma', Maqasid, Qawaid, basically the edifice of Islamic law and theology, issues a fatwa, and the visitation is now completed, right? Or you might have some academicians, as I mentioned, finding and sourcing modern bioethical frameworks that exist in the modern world, drawn from secular sources, or sometimes non-Muslim sources, at least Christian sources, Catholic sources, and say these also exist and analogously in Islam. Mashi, go ahead. Yeah. The next model of engagement, I would say another type of engagement, is what I call the native. And here the native engagement is an outgrowth of traditional moral and salvific discourses, right? That it's responsive to the juridical and theological concerns of Muslims where they are. And there is overlap, but let me make a distinction here. That our historical engagement with medicine is not, right, predates obviously modern bioethics, contemporary biomedicine. We have different frameworks, right? And we've had to have integration. When you talk about Tibb Yunani, that was some notion of Greek medicine integrated with some Islamic frameworks, or even Tibb Nawawi, right? We've had long-standing, as Muslims, engagement with this notion of health and healing. And so within that, we've had models and frameworks, but also babs. If you pick up any book on fiqh, you have fiqh al-tahara. And so those discourses are native to the Islamic tradition as it has adapted across the centuries. And that's what I mean by the native discourse. That is an outgrowth of that discourse and is responsive to those concerns. Right. So you might have someone talking about, for example, Ramadan's coming up. We have in our books the notion that if you put eardrops, you break your fast. Is that true or not? On our modern, if we now that we better understand, quote unquote, human anatomy. Can I take an inhaler? Right. Now, these are not hot button topics that are coming from the West. They're only endemic to Muslims, right? You have to pray or fast. So that's what I mean about the distinction between the native and the visitor discourse. Nonetheless, jurists are indispensable, right? And so you have a book like this, for example, by Mufti Ibn Adam al-Khalthari, talking about birth control and abortion, given the notion of how that has become medicalized, what Muslims should do or should not do, or how they should draw upon their tradition. A third model of engagement, I would say, is one that is lay professional, right? I'm still struggling with this term. As you see, lay professional might be a oxymoron by itself, but nonetheless, I struggle with how to typify this. But this is a discourse that addresses the practical concerns of Muslims in larger society, and it is the clinicians and public intellectuals who are filling this discursive gap. So this is people, right, who are the medical students. We're thinking about, well, I now took a class, as I shared with you, in bioethics. Someone was talking about this notion of Jewish views on gnosis and dying. Well, what is the Islamic response? So I don't know. Let's try to figure that out. So those are the individuals who are trying to figure that out. I'm feeling that gap between what you would find in juridical council fatwas and then local fatwas, right? And how you would engage with the lack of a, for example, established center, established journals, established sort of things that focus specifically on Islamic bioethics. Now, these Muslim actors, right, the clinicians and public health intellectuals, might draw upon different sources, right? So here you might see, and I know it's a little hard in this room, but we often hear, right, the verse in the Quran, right, that if you save the life of an individual, that you save the life of an individual. So they might quote this sort of scriptural text as the motivation for their practice, that I'm just saving lives, is what the Quran says. This verse as a atomistic verse is what I use, and then I go for it. Or that, you know, the hifz al-hayat, hifz al-nafs is the predominant maqasid, mashi. I'm going to use this to inform our practice, and this is how we should use, the lens through which we should look at any ethical or moral challenge. Right. So you have books written by lay or public intellectuals here. Now, in that engagement, I will say that many things are left untouched or unaddressed. Right. So left untouched, and on all three of these models, are the tools and methods of ethical legal deliberation from the Islamic sources themselves. And I'll give you an example of that. And what I mean by that is, for example, think about using fatawa, which is a tool of the juridical kind of discourse for engaging with the field of bioethics that recognizes multidisciplinarity, multiple viewpoints, plurality, that has, as I mentioned, normative, meta, narrative. There are multiple registers of concern and domain and different methodologies. They use simply fatawa and say, okay, Islamic bioethics equals fiqh, right? Fiqh is Islamic bioethics. That transposition like that, that's setting that up, signifies the idea that we've left untouched the tools and methods of Islamic ethical legal deliberation and the problems that occur. So there are discursive issues. For example, if we were just to use fatwa, right? The fatwa removed from context and lacking specificity can be misapplied. A fatwa, as a tool of the tradition, is applied to a context of a questionnaire. And the context and their contextual concerns are predominant, not the asal, hukum, right, or the issue that came up, right? You must resolve the moral dilemma faced by the Muslim actor so that their salvation is not in question, right? But removing from that context and the specificity, you can have misapplication elsewhere. When it is removed from the interpretive medium of the jurist, there's a potential for misreading. So in our classes in the academy and also in the seminary, we have to actually take a class of reading a fatwa. How do you read the fatwa? Right. What does that mean? It's not just, okay, there's some Quran here, hadith here, okay, but what is it? What are they doing? So for the person who then takes this outside of the medium, outside of the interpretive medium of the jurist, potential misreading. And then there's oftentimes an incomplete conceptualization of the problem space, because the problem space is not the problem space of the healthcare system. The problem space is the problem space of the individual actor within that system. It's not reformative or transformative. It is about that individual's salvation. So then you might have mistaken solutions when you overgeneralize. So that's the discursive problem, but there are also methodological issues in research. If you were to use fatwa, right? That all fatwa, if they're put together in book form, are subject to publication accessibility bias. There is no way to get every fatwa that's spoken about a specific topic ever together in any form. First of all, you don't have the mediums to do it, right? They're spoken, unspoken, on radio, written newspapers, right? There are multiple languages of the Muslim world. How would you gather all of that together in one place? Maybe the Istac library can do that, but I don't think anybody so far has been able to do that. So you will never have a comprehensive review. You'll always see part for the whole. And more importantly, those that are popularized are those that are unique or somehow odd. So how many times have you heard about fatwas against the haramness of playing chess, or the haramness of something, and then all of a sudden, but that's a minority, not a majority view, and that's why it's popularized. Or some scholars say something very unique about milk banking, and we say that is the fatwa, but the generation of scholars said milk banking is so it's just not talked about, right? The other thing about as a methodological issue for research on where fatwa become transposed into the main tool for developing Islamic bioethical theory is that they're contingent, they're non-normative. That is not the ideal. When you use darura, it means by definition, this is not the ideal form of what Islamic moral universal want you to do. But replete within that are fatwa based on darura. And as you all know well, that the legal is not the only way that we think about moral thinking in the tradition of Islam. It is not the full spectrum of Islamic morality. That is just the action, right? But it has nothing to say about the actor or the goal that the actor then achieves. So that's left, so attended to those frameworks. But then there's also many things that are unaddressed. I already gave you some notion. The nature of bioethics as it exists in the modernity, contemporary biomedicine, as a multidisciplinary, multi-tier field of inquiry is left alone by fatwa, right, and by these native or even the lay professional and visitor models. The goals of the discourse, right, the discourse of bioethics, academic bioethics, is peaceable pluralism, not an Islamic on top of anything. Yeah. Now, one might say that there is an overlap, and I don't disagree, but the notion of a global discourse is peaceable pluralism, pluralistic, right, policies and practices. And when you do bring religion into bioethics, know that it is a contested space. It's highly contested, both in the policy, political register, and in the academic discourse. You'll see two articles here from the American Journal of Bioethics, the highest rated journal of bioethics indexed, right, by Medline in the world. And they had a whole special issue, and there are multiple like this, on whether religion should be at all part of academic bioethics or not, right? So that's American Journal of Bioethics, but here's the Journal of Developing World Bioethics, saying the same thing. This is an article by the editor on the role of religion articles this journal seeks to publish. Now, all of the developing worlds, right, issues are supposed to be thought about in this journal, and the editor says that religion-based arguments do not fall in the category of public reason-based arguments. Therefore, such articles should not have much space within our own journal, right? Because bioethics scholars who are religious with religious bent analyze their preferred religion's policy and regulatory provisions, and therefore they just have particularistic sort of views. As I mentioned already, it's about peaceable pluralism. And so a field that wants to have this discourse cannot enter that discourse and that dialogue, potentially, right? That's left unaddressed by the existing engagements with bioethics. Although I'll share this article at the end, I did write a response to that article by the editor, and he was kind enough to allow that to go forth. And then in terms of practice, there are other problems with these models, right? So I mentioned to you that I spent a lot of my time thinking about brain death and the dying and care of the dying. So I'll give you just a snippet taste of this. So we have juridical academy. These two rulings here are from preeminent juridical academies in the Middle East that are multidisciplinary in nature, bring together jurists and physicians and sometimes policy makers. And both of them, this is 30, 40 years ago, were discussing, right, what was occurring in the United States and the West around brain death as legal death. So one council in Saudi Arabia said that brain death meets the thresholds for legal death in Islam. And they said, obviously they were in Arabic because the English version, that their view of brain death was when all vital functions of the brain cease irreversibly and the brain has started to degenerate. Now, those terms in red, I highlight because all those things are ambiguous. What are the vital functions of the brain? And how does the jurist tell us who figures that out? What does it mean to be irreversible? Does that mean death can be reversed when someone, right? How would you know that? Do you keep people on ventilators for years and say, okay, well, now they woke up, therefore this doesn't work? And then when you say brain has started to degenerate, no criteria in the world ever looks at the brain and does a biopsy before we declare you dead. Not at that time, not today. So this qarar here, and this ruling was based on this conception of what would be meeting the threshold for legal death in Islam. That doesn't exist anywhere. Yet it's used as a stamp of approval for brain death, right? Neurological criteria for death being substantiated by Islamic law, by preeminent jurists. That's the problem, the incomplete conceptualization of the problem space. Right. Another academy, the Islamic Organization for Medical Sciences in Kuwait, said no, brain death is akin to hayat ghayr mustaqirrah, unstable life in Islamic law. This is a category that was used, a classical category used on the battlefield of someone in the state between death and living, so a dying state, and different from marad al-maut. So they said, okay, well, if someone reaches a state of brain stem death, so then they clarified that the criteria to adjudicate death would be brain stem criteria. Some of the rulings of hayat ghayr mustaqirrah apply, but what do you mean by some rulings? Because no one's talking about the battlefield. We're talking about removing a ventilator. They said, okay, fine, you can remove a ventilator. But guess what? You can't donate your organs. That's what they said. But those things are happening at the same time in the healthcare system. When you declare death, you can do organ transplantation. So again, there was a little bit of how do we apply this, right? And what do you mean by some? Can a individual, and I'll share with you that there are cases where we have a woman who is pregnant, 20 weeks or so, who can be declared brain dead and then can be kept on a ventilator and some medical treatments to deliver the child at viability. Is that permitted? Left unaddressed, but occurs in the world today. Lastly, both of these councils, though they are non-sectarian, they bring together Sharia scholars as well, right? There are clear Sharia authorities that say that brain death is not death, and that anybody who is participating in removal of life support is morally culpable on that state. That view obviously was not privileged in these. They were not pluralistic in that sense. So this is my point of that these discourses have not met the mark to be applied in the healthcare system necessarily, although they are thought to be applicable to give clarity to physicians of what to do, what not to do. And then when you're in a non-majority context, how do we then have a plural policy? So, and you might say, AASIM's talking about all this stuff inside, but we have no problems in Malaysia here. So this is a colleague of mine, her book, Jenny Schreiber. She learned Malay. She's from Germany. She did an entire PhD here and learned Malay and talked about your brain death issues and transplantation in this book of hers by MIT Press. So I encourage the audience to pick that up. But similar things happened here. And I don't know Malay. She said even the term brain death, how you put this together makes no sense to the common person on the street. In Malaysia. Now, I take her word for it, but she talked about how the discourse was misunderstood. So, in any case, the lay model, I'll give an example here, also has problems. So this is the model, again, where physicians, perhaps like myself, and public intellectuals engage in to fill in the gaps, right, of what the jurists say and what we should do in practice. This is a national survey I did in the United States with Muslim physicians from a Muslim physician group. The punchline is that we asked them how they felt about their familiarity with Islamic bioethics. Right, we left that term to their definition. So 85% of this national survey said that they were somewhat or very familiar with Islamic bioethics. Over 50%, so majority, said that they were somewhat or greatly influenced by Islamic bioethics in their practice. And 90% said that Islam is a very important or most important part of their life. So a very religious group says they're very familiar with this discourse and it really has a real import upon their practice. But another question was, well, what do you do when you face a problem? Who do you ask? So this bar chart shows that 50%, right? When they face a challenge, they don't talk to imams, they don't talk to scholars, they don't read Islamic books, and they very almost never look to juridical council rulings. The most frequent resource when they face a problem that's of Islamic bioethics nature that they talk to are other Muslim physicians. That's sometimes 47%. But largely, these do it themselves. I am Muslim, I can figure it out. Right? So you see the problem with a discourse that's based on lay professionals. But where is that Islamic being informed by? And who are they in conversation with? Right? Now, this is a survey from a decade ago, 2013. And inshallah, I hope that has improved. But my point is that there are clear problems when you rely on this category of people as well. And then, no matter all of this, so I told you what was left unaddressed, what was left untouched, and I gave you the problems and the gaps. Now, guess what? In the larger scope of global bioethics discourse, Islam is absent. So this is from a mentor of mine many, many years ago, right, 2005. But I told you I was interested in death. So he did an entire literature review on death, dying, and informatics, right? What do we find in the premier databases in medicine, bibliographic databases on religion? So he found that for every 7 papers on Christianity or Christian views, or all on Christian populations, there were 6 papers on Jewish views or on Jewish population on death and dying, right? And 1 on Muslims and Islam. Now think about the population differences here. There was 1. So we might have something to say, but certainly it's not reaching the audience of practicing physicians, and for us as physicians to learn from each other, or for the policy stakeholders, other stakeholders to learn from. We're not there in that discourse. We have no endowed chairs at leading bioethics centers, 0, zip, across the world. That's like bioethics, right? So no, we have in the top 10 journals of bioethics in the world, right? By standard criteria, there's almost no Muslim. Now I'm not talking about Muslim representation, right? There's a Israeli scholar on 1 journal. In Kennedy Institute of Ethics, there's a Shi'i scholar, ILYAS, and then I'm on two of these. But I don't do much for them. So my point is, there's no Muslim voices on Israeli awards. So I told you they're not present. We're not writing. And then even if you want to have some voice in what gets produced, you have no voice. Of a global population, where we say ourselves are 2 billion, we say a lot about how many Muslims are in the world. Well, in this discourse, we are wholly absent. So now let's try to clarify a little bit, and I'm going to come to the end of my talk. As I said, this is just some preliminary to a conversation I hope to have. So let me address the question. You want to talk about challenges? Where does Islamic bioethics reside? And if you want me to answer it, I'm going to actually, when I do this in my classes, I don't answer the question. I ask you a question. I say the question's wrong. I want to ask you, what do you think? Right. So I know there's people online, so we don't have time to do that, but let me just, in your own mind, think about the following. This is a talk. So before I get the question, let me share with you another snippet. So I was invited to a talk on Islamic bioethics with 2 or 3 other preeminent scholars around the world. Okay. This was a flyer for the talk. It was at University of Pennsylvania. Probably heard that name, a very reputable university. This was a flyer. And that talk was held at the Middle East Center, sponsored by the Nursing and Penn Forum for Global Islamic Studies. Now, all I've told you about is Islamic bioethics, where it should reside, right? At this preeminent university, a talk by, I remember 2, so I think there was also a 3rd, 4, say, preeminent global discussants at least, or commentators, maybe scholars on Islamic bioethics were coming. Where were they hosted? In the Middle East Center, right? And the nursing school sponsored the talk. But look at the flyer. Now, if you're a student coming to this talk, who do you think this talk is for? You see the flyer where there is some, looks like medical students or trainees or professionals wearing a hijab, one is wearing a niqab, right? The patient's wearing a kufi, and a ward that does not look like any ward that would be at University of Pennsylvania, right? And it's being sponsored by the Middle East Center. So who's this relevant to? And that kind of messaging, I think, is very important. And I'm not picking on the people who made the flyer. And maybe this was subconscious how they made the flyer, but tells you where it should reside in some sort of way, right? Not in the medical school, not right in the religious studies school, but at a center for looking at populations that are like this. So who is Islamic Bioethics for? Is it for Muslims in Muslim lands like this? Flyer might suggest. Or is it for humanity at large? We talk about Islamization, we talk about Islam being, right, a global religion. We talk, even if in our internal discourse, we talk about Salafic discourses, we talk about Islam, right? Well, if it's for humanity at large, where should it reside? And who are its professionals, right? Are these for professors at universities who, in their ivory towers, think about these issues? Is it consultants who make money? I don't make much money. I'm not a consultant at that level. All right. Alhamdulillah, I make alhamdulillah, I'm saying, but this is not me. I'm not a consultant for industries, right? And policy in that sort of way. I advise, but consultants who, okay, let me tell you how to make this pharmaceutical company Islamicize this flyer so you can get patient populations to sign up for the study. That's not my work, but there are people who do that. Let me tell you how to make these things work in the Muslim world so you can get your drug trial here, right? Or the policy world. Or is it professional, other professionals, religious advisors in communities and committees? Religious advisors meaning imams and jurists, right? Sitting in the community or in a committee. Is that, are those the professionals that will take this quasi field and make it established? And then if it does fit, I'm talking about academic bioethics, if it does fit, then does it fit within the Department of Religious Studies because it comes from grounding in Islam, or within area studies because it's about them, right? Or in schools of divinity, in seminaries, right? Where jurists and juridical authorities and theologians come together, and they're the ones who say, here is a vision for Islam, therefore, this is what a bioethics from Islam will look like. Or is it within medical centers and university hospitals where we all, should we get sick and may Allah protect us, engage with the questions of health and healing, largely. So I'm not going to answer the question, but I think these are the questions that need to be asked. And someone like the people here had a vision of what Istac looks like, right? Where should it sit? How does it relate to the university? How does it relate to discourse? How does it think about Islamic thought? How is the building put together? They had vision. They had thought that we are still benefiting from. Think we're 50, 60 years behind. For this field, we need similar thought, deep thinking, planning, putting together. This ad hoc enterprise isn't going to work and has not worked. So I'm coming close to the end. If you're all saying he's spoken too long, I don't speak this long without engagement, but we'll get to that in shortly. So I will further ask, what is Islamic bioethics? Whatever Islamic vision you want to put on this field, is it demarcated as a field of inquiry, meaning that the Islamic relates to the subject matter and the researchers who engage in that subject matter, right? Because bioethics is a field of inquiry. Or is it as a discipline, meaning professionalization? Is the Islamic coming to think about, you know, an agreed upon set of content, scope, and assumptions? Or is it in the method, the systematic mode of analysis and the use of tools, right? As you saw from a journal editor, public reason. And so are we now going to talk about Islam and public reason and then engage in the discourse? And that's what the Islamic comes in, right? Ethics committee. So I'll give you another little sort of anecdote here. I shared with you that alhamdulillah, I did a fellowship in clinical medical ethics. I taught for a decade, actually 12 years almost, a course on religion, bioethics, and the practice of medicine to fellows in clinical ethics. These are individuals, right, who are going to become stamped to provide ethics consultation in the hospital, in academic hospitals. And so I remember a seminar I was giving, and a student asked me, AASIM, are you in this classroom an Islamic bioethicist or a Muslim bioethicist? I said, what do you mean? He said, we sit here in this class, and so he said, in this class and in our case consultation. And we had this group of different specializations. We have some lawyers, we have some nurses, we have some physicians, we sit together and a case comes to us and someone says that my patient or my patient's family views this, and here's what our doctor team thinks. How do we proceed and resolve this conflict or perceived conflict? A lot of the time, the issues are just about communication, not really about an ethical conflict, but sometimes they're ethical conflicts, right? I want to withdraw life support, you can't withdraw life support, so on and so forth. In that space, and this is what he said, well, who are you? And I said, well, I think I'm not an Islamic bioethicist. I'm a Muslim bioethicist, not because I live in the United States, because the notion that what passes for a stamp of approval is just us thinking about it with no religious training of different traditions and views, and we're just coming together and say, okay, well, if this committee of the hospital says it's okay, then it's okay. I don't know if that's really the normative view of an Islamic tradition. So in this space, maybe I am a Muslim entering upon this conversation, and I'm glad that I have a voice at this table. And when it's a Muslim patient, I can maybe say something of the normative, what Islamic scholars, others would think about. But we're not doing the works of what potentially an Islamic Bioethics Council might look like, or an Islamic, a Muslim hospital in a Muslim country would want for an Islamic, for an ethics committee to do. And I say that again in engaging, when we think about our hospitals here, and I have a beautiful hospital in Pontan, that was built after or during the middle of the pandemic. What is the ethics committee do there? Is it about the Islamic Bioethics becomes a mode of analysis? Or are we still just thinking about public reason and a council of peers who adjudicate what is the normative? So for me in my work, I think of Islamic Bioethics as a discourse, a little bit of answers here. It's a research or a quasi-research field of inquiry that brings together these two things, right? That you bring together the medical field and an Islamic authority. Oftentimes it is a physician and a jurist, but there are groups of scholars around this, social scientists, right? That we are using the tradition to address moral questions and ethical issues that arise out of biomedical sciences. So it is in some way a responsive and reactive discourse, necessarily so. But it is linked to the tradition in a specific ways, right? And it's linked to the tradition from the scriptural sources as well as the community through which that tradition is adjudicated. Knowledge comes through communities of practice and communities of scholars. That's how it's mediated and understood. And we cannot remove that from the tradition either. So those barriers of traditions must be engaged. So the components for me, and the way I think about it, and this is just my current thinking, perhaps it changes in a few years, and certainly a few years ago it was different, is that we bring together the three aspects, or you call the three sort of fonts of ethics, right? You have the end goal or ethics, right? So we use theology and philosophy, usul and kalam, to think about the production. You have an act, that act produces or achieves something in society. You use perhaps, and I'll also say maqasid potentially can help us here, although that's more than legal register, but theology and philosophy. How is health? Is it athia? If it's athia, how is that produced in society? How do we make that happen? How is healing, shifa, produced in society? That notion of theology and philosophy will help fill that content to produce what we want to produce in health in society. The legal register looks at the act. So you have fiqh here, right? The moral status of action is adjudicated by that. So this is now looking at the agent. You've decided what your thought about what they will produce and achieve in society and for themselves. Now you're using legal register to adjudicate the agent's action, the action of the agent, and then the agent itself, practical, virtue, ethics, or other literature here, right? So you bring these three things together, adjudicating the action, the motivations underlying component of the actor, and the goal of society, and then you can have Islamic bioethics. One of these three missing, I would argue you don't really have it. How does it work, and who does it talk to? Well, Islamic bioethics then must use those three, at least those three domains as the moral machinery upon which you draw to engage with these stakeholders and dialogical partners, right? Clinical practice, social science, medical science, moral philosophy and bioethics, contemporary, secular and religious, and health policy. That you cannot, unless you do this multi-tier involvement, you're not going to have a solution that doesn't work or is missing a key component. And in this book, Medicine History, I talk about this at length. And then it's got to move beyond fiqh. I already mentioned that, to think about where does empirical modes of reasoning fit within Islamic bioethics, aside from adab and where the narrative fit. In the end, when you construct this field, where should it sit? It should sit at a center that bridges Islamic, Muslim, and health studies. Right? It's connected to medical centers, universities, and seminaries. All these things has to be globally recognized for bioethics research and training, and globally because it has to be involved in a global discourse. And it must be multidisciplinary, right? With bridge builders, scholarly communities, right? We need people sitting down in the same room, thinking about things from different lenses to have a holistic conceptualization of the problem space to generate a holistic solution. And as I already mentioned to you, that at present in the Muslim world and in the world, there are no dedicated centers. There's there's one, I think, or two, maybe degree granting programs now. Very few internships and no Medline index journals on Islamic bioethics. So we have a ways to go. With that, I'll end. As I shared some anecdotes, I shared some with you. Hopefully I can share some more, but I'm happy to have conversation now. Jazakallah khair, barakallahu fikum.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. AASIM. So we've heard about bioethics. We now open the floor to questions. But before that, I should summarize a little bit. So this is how we put our worldview into our everyday of life, even looking into death and into our fields of study. And if you look at it in other ways, how we understand life and death and our field of study based on our Islamic worldview. And if we have laws that control us in this world, we should see how the world above us actually, they also control, even the tiniest thing in this world. And the world is changing, and does religion change along? This is also a question. If not, in which, in which method should we choose to integrate our own life challenges with our belief? And this shapes our belief and how we apply it in our daily life. And then comes the subject of multidisciplined and bioethics. And this again, our identity as a Muslim and Islam as our way of life. And Islam is the solution of everything for, things that appear yesterday and today. Okay, we open the floor to questions, inshallah. There's one in the Zoom from Sister Afifa Abbas. Salam Prof. PADELA, what Islam says, and is it allowed in Islam as being newly ventured in scientists working on merging AI with human brain cells? This new technology capability in the future may eventually surpass the performance of existing purely silicon-based hardware.
SubhanAllah. Jazakallah khair for that question. Oftentimes when my students ask me what Islam says, I say, can you go find me Islam? Where's Islam? Is he in this room? Huh? Where's Islam? Yeah, I should ask Islam. In a tongue-in-cheek way. But I think what you're highlighting, sister, is a topic of that so far in my reading has not been addressed fully or even partially. So there's this thing, I think you're referring to this idea, and I'll share for the room and for the people who are abroad, that there are these networks, neural networks that are being created that are based on biological material initially. So there's so you have some neurons that you take from you either develop them through stem cells, or you take some neurons and you revitalize them and you create neural networks. So this biological material, and there's a question, and there's a big report that was put out from, I think, either the United States Commission on this topic, where you put them together. And as you add hundreds to thousands, now millions of neurons, the first question becomes, is this biological material going to potentially become self-aware or sentient, right? Because for them, everything resides in the brain, right? This is biological material upon which consciousness supervenes, right? Or emerges. So there's a theoretical question there. So they limit it to a certain amount of neurons, right? But then these neural networks can then start learning, just like you have the AI technology, you were talking about machine learning, that it can do experiments where there are functionality emerge in a certain sort of way, maybe not awareness. And then the question becomes, technologically, how do you then adapt those biological to technological and create networks that are integrated? So there's many issues here. One I mentioned for you just about the theological question about sentience and then what does that mean for us as human beings. I think one of the most important things is that biotechnology changes the way we think about ourselves fundamentally, right? And we as Muslims need to think about that, right? So when I just said to you, if biological material can then have some self-awareness or consciousness or whatever else it is, then what does that mean? That this is just biology? Or as you saw in popularized, right, ChatGPT or whatever becomes self-aware, does that mean that they're sentient and therefore they have a soul? Right? Silicon, right? Silicon is organic material. Maybe there's a soul inhabiting the silicon material in your machines. I don't know. But my point, or maybe it's jinn. I'm now being a glib again. My point is that these fundamental questions are left unaddressed. But then there are ethical questions, right? So maybe those are higher level, the ethical questions of can we use this material or not? Should we have regulation around how it's used? How is procured? Is there need to be now consent, right, around these sorts of things? So I don't have a short answer for you, but all of these things, I remember a couple of years ago when this report came out, I engaged with a computer scientist in Pakistan and then a moral theologian. I think she actually might have graduated from AASIM in one of her degrees. I said, let's write about this. We hadn't gotten a chance to, but this is very interesting. You need a scientist to help us understand what this means, right? And you need a theologian, and I'm just someone to bring the two together. But I do think we need a holistic response to lay out the questions to then give you answers. But I think that there will be significant ways in which we change how we think about ourselves and what the determinants of that would be. And I'm actually very worried about neural networks because not because of sentience, but because what happens in medicine is that when you create technology and you think there's a potential solution, immediately people clamor for that without thinking about the long-term ramifications of that.
Parvinaz, you want to ask something?
Someone question, someone wants to speak.
Yeah, someone is to speak. Please.
Assalamu alaikum, sir. I'm Saima Ali from Pakistan. As a social science is the study of human behavior, also the branch of biology. So how would the social scientist contribute in the study of bioethics?
Most of I think many ways, and I'll tell you most of the research that I do empirical is social scientific in nature. But I can give you several responses this way. So one would be that why is the question is what a social scientific lens helps us answer. So why are we talking again? Every topic brain death. Why did these two terms come together, brain and death? Was there a specific vision of the human being that led us to think about the biological material dying? I mean, do you talk about kidney death or toe death? We talk about brain death. So there's a historical, sociological, cultural value system that led these two things to come together as terms. And then why is the question being asked now whether we can use individuals who have met the criteria for death as donors? Why is that? So the social scientific lens helps us think about not just the history of terms, but why the societal point has come to have this be the problem space. So they're descriptive, but within that, so that's description. But there's also normative. So now let's say the back end. Told you how you can help with describing the problem space. And if you want to add policymakers also, right? Why is that policy a question? But in the normative space, there's also a role, often neglected. So say, for example, that, not say this is true. So the example I use is again in the death and dying domain, that oftentimes we say as an ethical sort of guideline that families should make decisions about withdrawing life support of their loved ones when their loved one is incapable of doing so, right? Globally, this happens. God forbid something happens to your relative, you're their caretaker, you're the power of attorney. If you did all that legal work, you make the decision whether to withdraw life support or not. We do that, and doctors most often don't do that unilaterally, and sometimes it leads to court cases if you do so, even if they have a legal right to do so, because you want families to accept, right, what's happening, and you want them to have some ability to at least have a dialogue around what's occurring, right? So they make the decision. Okay. Do you know that individuals, there's scientific research, right, who are make those decisions upon their parents, for example, not only get stressed, have high levels of PTSD after, like they can be, like there's a proportion of individuals who have PTSD after, and then do not engage in healthcare system in certain ways. Similarly, do you know individuals, women, who have, there's this notion of birth trauma. So as you know, giving birth is medicalized a lot. Home birth is rarity in some Western nations. And that medicalization is because we can monitor, right? So now you can know beeps and bongs are happening and what's happening, what's not happening, right? And that and if an outcome, poor outcome happens, defined broadly, that women who traditionally thought about birthing at home went to the healthcare system, now have birth trauma, and therefore then their behavior of how they engage within the next pregnancy is very different. Social scientific understanding of what that means is important. Why? Because if you say La darar wa dirar fil Islam, your hukum can't start having harm perpetrated. And this is harm, not is maybe you say it's not yaqeen, but it is harm that we know will occur. And can't Islam then have a solution that is not just the dominant mode? Okay, no, you should have monitoring, and it's okay. Some people have birth trauma, or parents, children should make decisions for the parents, despite the fact that you can create chaos in the family, right? Who's the decision maker? And that some of those individuals, in certain cases, will then have PTSD, right? And have anxiety and not want to make medical decisions again. So that's also the normative side. That I'm not saying you make the normative judgment, but you bring out the normative points of what a moral stance should be that are often neglected. I hope suffices. Yes.
Thank you, sir. However, Islam described the postpartum trauma for the pregnant lady and after birth. Ever discussed in Islam?
You want me to, or you will discuss?
Yes. However, Islamic point of view discussed in anywhere of the world. Then what should do for that lady who is suffering from the postpartum trauma?
I didn't quite get the question there. So I don't know how, because the studies have not been done in a way that maybe there are, I haven't read them. But that if you were to, my point is that piece of data needs to be accounted for at the dialogue table when you're developing moral guidance and policies. If that voice is not present, then right, first off, the research isn't there, then there's nothing, right? As I said, we do very little research. Then if that research there is not brought to the dialogue table, then you cannot at least account for it in your solution, right? That we're developing a solution space here. And that's how I think social scientists do need to be part of that discussion, so that we can think about how such and such ruling would play out in society, right? And I'm talking about both policy level, anthropological, sociological, and I do behavioral studies, right? So I try to change people's behaviors towards health and healing. And we can talk all about knowledge. We know knowledge does not change behavior. So that's the work, the interventions that I do, thinking about how we can improve people's understanding of their faith to be able to prepare to make decisions around end of life care or organ transplantation, or around mammography, cancer screening, so on and so forth. So I want to say I don't dismiss it. I think we have left it out. I do think that there is a caution, if I might say, that we have to put each science or any science discipline within its proper place. Oftentimes, we don't do that when we come together, right? We don't dialogue in a way that is epistemically humble with each other. And we all think we know everything. And I think that's the problem.
There's another question from Mohammed Asri. You want to speak? Okay, please.
Many thanks for this stimulating lecture. I have many questions, but I must stress I'm interested in Islamic bioethics. I come from Hong Kong with a small Muslim minority, and I was told there's less than 10 medical doctors in Hong Kong. My emphasis or my point of interest is actually at the application of Islamic bioethics at the point of care. Now, at the point of care, we're talking about a tripartite relationship, a recipient of healthcare, a healthcare provider, and a biomedical issue. An ideal consultant will be everything: philosopher, scholar, jurist, medical practitioner, and everything. But on the patient side, he or she or the family is facing only one person, the medical doctor. How would the medical doctor able to receive the proper education and a proper communication skill and a proper theological background and scholarly understanding of the biomedical issue to advise the patient to make a decision at the point of care? The second issue is how should the dissemination of decisions or deliberations on biomedical issues from the Islamic perspective can be given to the medical doctor. I must say, I'm a physician, I'm a practicing physician. So I'm much more interested in the way the information can be transferred.
Yeah.
Now, you and I understand, we are in the medical profession, just always busy. You can't read anything after work. You have to do it over spare time, which is extremely limited, especially in the situation in Hong Kong, where you work more than 18 hours a day. So you have very minimal time for you to be educated and learn and how to communicate. Are there any ways simpler that something like an algorithm that a person or a doctor can follow, and then with the similar information given to the patient, which do not have the right expertise to understand not only the terms, but the details in the biomedical issue? How do you advise about it?
Yeah, so I really appreciate the question, and I think that's the essential project that we have to be involved with, right? That you have and this is what I've been trying to do for the last 2 decades, is figure out ways in trying to address this conundrum of how, at the point, as you said, I like the term, at the point of care, Islamic whatever bioethics comes into play. So let me give you some responses to interventions in that domain. First is on the patient side. So on the patient side, a lot of my work has focused on informing Muslims communities, right, around how to engage with the healthcare system by demystifying what the healthcare is and those loaded jargon terminology. So an example of that we did a randomized controlled trial of workshops in masajid in 2 cities in the United States on 2 critical decision points. One was on end-of-life care, the other was on organ donation. Sometimes they come together, sometimes they're apart. And the goal was that through workshops, these were 3-hour workshops on Sunday, Saturday morning, that people would attend, and the workshop was I'll give you the format in a second. It was the workshop was a lecture on the Islamic dimensions of that problem, and then a physician would talk about the questions that come up and arise and how the technology comes. What we wanted to do is give people the religious views on, for example, for and against brain death or organ donation. So now you understand not just the rulings, but the rationale behind them. And then we wanted to tell you about the procedural questions, right? Okay, well, if this happens, then this would happen, or how would this happen? Because they didn't have procedural understanding of the context of the question, the decisional context. So you give them decisional context, the technological terms, and then religious, and then you say, okay, after that, we leave, the experts leave the room, and you discuss amongst your peers. We had peer educators that would just have conversations. So that trial showed increased preparedness, knowledge, and decision preparedness and knowledge around these domains. We were interested in that, right? Behavioral sort of, can you now make a decision when you're facing this challenge of loved ones? So this was wholly set for communities. Some of the people who attended the workshops were maybe allied health practitioners, but it was for you to understand when the decision comes up, what to think about in a pluralistic way. But the dialogue at the end, we were out of the room. Those sheets of conversation led to a decisional guide. We created a booklet, for example, on end-of-life care, where we created a fictional character who would go through the questions that the people had around the room, and then bring together the religious and the medical professionals. And a scenario is kind of like a video game, right? Here's, okay, my mother died. Here's what the doctor's saying. What does that really mean? Because a lot of the terms are fact value fusions. When you say suffering, your parents suffering and they're unconscious, what does that mean? Maybe you're seeing some signs of pain or vital sign abnormalities, but do you really know what suffering is? The term is used in medical conversations where it's a fact value fusion, a medical fact, and you apply the label already, and you told the patient this is suffering. And then what is the patient going to say, or the patient's or family going to say? So the point is that's one model, community-based education. And I think that, and alhamdulillah, this is not just on those two topics. We've done it on my magazine, that there's a model that we've used, I've used, and I've shown proven through at least randomized controlled trials in the United States and efficacy trials. We're doing that now also actually in the UK. The physician piece, I think, is is harder to tackle, because physicians by our nature think we know a lot, and we're very bright, and we can figure things out, and we don't need someone else. So, but I'll give you an example here. So for physicians, I've had oftentimes for 9 years at Chicago, we had a medical student internship where you'd come together for a month, you'd take a course, and then you would pick a topic, and okay, here's what physicians data say, here's what patient data say, here's what jurists say, here's what social scientists say. Now, how do we think about this? So you get familiar with the discourse, but also recognize that everybody's got a piece of the problem. For them, as you said, the communication skills oftentimes you learn in medical school, communication with patients, critical conversations. There are workshops we do in the United States. I don't know how it works in Hong Kong, but we have these simulated patient scenarios where you learn communication skills. What you don't have is knowledge, right? And what you don't know is the limitations. Okay, so what are you in this conversation? Are you a Muslim advisor, or are you just a physician? Which hat do you wear? You wear one hat, not three, one. And you delineate and discuss and disclose that hat when you come to the counter. I know nothing about neuro-oncology or whatever else it is, but I am a practitioner, so I'll tell you, and I'm Muslim, and I'll tell you what I know as a Muslim, right? Or what I've read. I know nothing about technology. So we give them the tools to make them think about what they know and what they don't know, and disclose what you don't know to the patient to have better communication. And then link you up with what are the resources. So if you have to find something, do you have a juridical council or a body or discussant or a mufti? Because you're not the one who's going to give that patient an out, right? It's going to be that mufti or that chaplain. And I say we have chaplains, we're training chaplains to have some basis of understanding of this discourse. So that's the work. This is tougher, right? Because there is no standard curriculum. I don't know what occurs at IIUM. I know there are some case scenarios and so on and so forth, but at least in the quote unquote West, there's no religion is contested in bioethics, and there's no space for them within the curriculum to learn a little bit about their own. It all has to be extra outside of the time, right? In the busy residency years. So it's much tougher nut to crack. And I think that the caution I would have is, yes, we have online courses and all, but you really learn by thinking through cases. And I've asked colleagues, this particular case book where people then can think about it. And we're going to have my own initiative in Islamic medicine is going to have case consultations together online. People bring a case, we talk together like we do in clinical ethics case. We don't have, the case already happened. We're just going to discuss. We're not going to give a fatwa, but we want you to think and reason better. But that's a long-term engagement, unless there some Muslim society and Muslim medical school says we're going to have dedicated space in the curriculum. It's very hard. And I know I'm taking a lot of time. Let me say one thing, in a non-Muslim space. I'm part of the medical school curriculum in the Medical College of Wisconsin. This year, they created a new curriculum called Fusion. And the pandemic was really challenging for all of us. And this new course is called the Good Doctor course. It occurs over 18 months in the first 18 months of medical school. And that Good Doctor course, put together by an ethicist, non-Muslim ethicist, but she's amazing, is about the hidden curriculum made apparent. What does it mean to be good? What does it mean to be a good doctor? How do you think about that? What ties bind? What divide you? What is your relationship to society? What is your relationship to patients? All those soft topics, not the anatomy, physiology, pharmacology, none of it. It's all about and you have a coach with you. So I'm one of these coaches that watches students over 18 months and face the professionalization challenges of that character. And then you say, okay, now you have some semblance of how to be a good doctor. At least you know what the questions are. I created a curriculum at IIUM. We're talking about the human being. We don't talk about the human being in medicine. Where's its origin? What's its composition? What's its nature? What's its future? We just talk about treating patients, but the patient's a human being. So all these things you brought together, but you need space in the curriculum to do so. So anyway, I give a very long answer to a short question, but it's not a simple one to answer.
Yeah, it's good. Sometimes we see doctors as medicine. You don't need that medicine, but the doctor itself is the medicine. All right. We have Prof. Murad, you want to add? Okay, please.
I have Thank you for your enlightening presentation. I have some random thoughts about in responding to what you've said. One is I recall in the early 80s, I was in Minnesota, your twin, Wisconsin. I was doing liberal arts, political science, and we had to take courses from the other disciplines. So it was in the life sciences. I took genetics, and at that time, early 80s, there was this issue of genetic engineering and gene splicing, ethical issues actually pertaining to humanity. And I find that there was no Islamic response. But in my class, I was the only Muslim. And the professor will ask me. And I told him, fall back to the scriptures. The Genesis, New and Old Testament, and Al-Baqarah. I made a paper and he took it. And he asked me permission to circulate it in his parish. He was a priest also. So I think that was perhaps the initial consciousness of religion with regard to the new issue of genetic engineering. There was no Muslim discourse at that time. But you brought a very important issue that needs to be taken up in Malaysia. Intervention in the medical curriculum. I've written a piece, not an academic piece, but a commentary in one of the newspapers on the humanities in the medical curriculum. There has to be some humanities and social science intervention. I was writing it with 3 people, 2 doctors and myself. I thought that, and when my daughter was taking medicine, I told her, there any courses on music or art, whatever? She said no. And no ethics course also. So I think you were to talk to the medical school in this university. I thought that I think the medical fraternity and the medical council and medical schools must pick it up. This is a long-standing issue. Where do we locate ethics? Again, the problem here with the social sciences. We take lock, stock, and barrel the Anglo-American social science in Malaysia over the last 50 years. Where is the sacred space in that corpus? So similarly here, when we talk about medicine, where is that sacred space? And we as Muslims, I think we need to factor in that reason and rationality in a way that would benefit humanity, not only for Muslims. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment and for the work that you did way back when, perhaps to help the people thinking about how Islam might view these technologies that have now gone on to be used in medicine. I'll say that before in professional schools, right? Before you want to be a doctor, you have to learn how to be a human. Who teaches you that? Where is that? Right? I mean, it's really interesting. You said the humanities, right? And so, yeah, I was a biomedical engineer. I told you a little bit about my history, but I don't know how you can doctor without being a human and knowing what the human being is, right? And at least have some notion of the humanities. I mean, we have very little appreciation for this because we become about technique, right? And it's not our fault. This is also patience. You see signs, billboards about, I was driving through, I wasn't driving, but you have all these clinics about, I'll just tell you one sign in Malaysia said virtue and vanity. Virtue and vanity for it was like a cosmetic surgery type clinic, which I thought was very interesting. Where you have now juxtaposed, right? This is a sign of Qiyamah, that things that are good are become bad. Yeah, virtue and vanity. So my point is that you have a physician's license is now doing these things, and that's the tagline for their clinic, which tells you something's missing. And our absorption of technologies, not understanding how they came about and what they're for, we've made the human being a bunch of interchangeable body parts, really. That's what the human being is. It's just a biological material that can be changed, maybe preserved and live on. Why? Because we don't know what the human being is. Science can't provide that. Maybe the material cause, maybe, I don't know, informal, maybe, but not really. And so that's, we've left all that. So I think that we must do some interventions in curricula. And it's not just by here, the fiqh rulings. I mean, I say that, I think that's important, that's a component, but it's not that, because fiqh is about understanding the problem space, right? Deep understanding, not just use. And yes, I do say this is the rulings from the muftis. I myself seek rulings when I have issues. We are going to work with that, but it is not the end goal that we have this applicative band-aid solutions on top, but the system, the way of thinking, the people within that are not changed in some transformative way.
Yeah, please.
Now the hard question comes. Be easy on be easy on me. After the hard question comes.
No. If you don't mind, I have two questions, two comments. First of all, congratulations to you on your new book, Islam and Biomedicine, which you co-edited with Dr. Afifi. Wanted to ask you, has there been any response to that book, especially in the United States, coming mainly from the mainstream, medical people, and of course bioethics as well. In other words, because I think what we expect, what we would like to see, not so much from the Muslim side, but those, I mean, the mainstream medical profession, the scientists, which part of that book, for example, attracted the attention? That's number one. Or maybe you address that one first.
Sure. So I'll say two things in response. So the Islamic Biomedicine book, Jazakallah Khair, and may Allah bless the funders and the authors in that book, and Dr. Afifi. I mean, it was a 4-year plus project, and I know it's being launched in Malaysia from the I think next week. But the response from the traditional, so that is put together by Springer. The response from the side of the, as you asked, specifically from this medicine side, the secular space over there, has been largely ignored. Yeah, so that book has gotten some, I mean, it's new, right? So it's only a year and change out. We haven't had reviews out in many journals of that book, so it hasn't hit that. So I'm saying at this point, ignored is too strong. Let me say, not yet received fully is a better word to say. But from people within the specific professors, right? They have started using some of that book to teach in these classes. Interesting, not in medical academies, but in sort of like divinity schools or area studies, right? Oh, this is an interesting course I'm teaching on Islam and knowledge, or Islam and science. I want to use that book. Can I use some chapters? And can you give me some insight? Can you give me a little, and can you have an author question answer session after my lecture? So I found it again, where does Islamic Bias located? Right in these, in the sort of Islam, sort of, right, religious studies, Islam and science courses, some of that is, which is fine, but not within the healthcare system or the medical academy itself. And maybe that's the initial. So that's a really honest response. I think it's a little bit too new. There haven't been reviews yet in those traditional journals or even Zygon and so on and so forth. Inshallah, there will be positive reviews and that will be picked up. And where it is thus far been received has been in just those boutique, again, I don't mean the majority, but those boutique classes, right? Not the traditional course of these special classes some people are putting on Islam and science. I will say that the funder of that, but Champion Religions Trust, funded the project that had led to that book. They were very, very interested and very pleased with that book. And I believe that they're going to have some further promotion of that, inshallah, after the stuff that happens here. So.
Well, in that case, we would like to see from the Muslims, I mean, especially from the Islamic University here and other medical schools, faculty of medicine in Muslim countries. I think we need to get them to respond to this. That book is going to be launched here at Istac here on the 10th, and also going to be afternoon one day, half a day symposium. But I think, unfortunately, from a personal point of view, I think the emphasis on in the symposium is more on the practical side. But I would like to see, a mixed kind of thing. This brings me to the second point. I believe that you can respond to my comments. After listening to you, we are still, since the beginning of that consciousness on bioethics, we are still basically in that transition. Basically, it's transition period. The discourse is in transition period, especially you raised many questions, for example, very, very pertinent questions that Muslim community needs to pay attention to. In other words, now I would like to go back to in the case of Islamic civilization, we saw two parallel discourses. One stream, one discourse was what we call basically the juridical, was based as the juridical, medical jurisprudence. Yeah, it's a juridical approach, which in the last is not really, I say, creative, but it is more responsive. In other words, it's reactive. It was reactive against certain issues, and we expect the juries to come up with fatwa to the latest. So it was not really creative in that sense. Yeah, although there were exceptions. You have, for example, also medical doctors who were juries at the same time, including Ibn al-Nafis. I mean, it's not just ordinary person. He was well-known jurist as well as in sense, is a medical scientist. Now, the other one is the more philosophical and scientific stream that discussed. The two often interacted in the past. They interacted, but then they have their different goals. It's not the same. And I think the philosophical and scientific medicine and all its branches, where Ibn Sina is situated, I mean, they all basically they were scientists, but at the same time they have their own ethics. In other words, precisely because ethics was also part of their in the ethics and medicine were part of what we call the intellectual sciences. In other words, this aqli in science, aqliya. Now, so there was a difference at the time. In other words, the scientists, the Muslim scientists, were at the same time very knowledgeable also about the ethics, but the approaches are different. The approach of the jurists to ethics and the approach of the medical scientists, there was convergence, but that still is not the same. So I'm thinking now when we talk about the mainstream people concerned, professional in bioethics, the mainstream, and we are on the kind of on the margin, trying to enter into the discourse. How do you see? Has there been progress? In other words, now we have medical scientists, I mean, bioethicists. They are concerned with very issues that we often refer under the name Islamic, but they don't talk about. They don't use the word Islam. They use the word Islamic term. But basically, what they are doing is what Islam wanted: the ethics. Do you see that, for example, in the United States, that kind of, in other words, it's not simply the people who carry the name Islam, but it's more important what's said by them, what is discourse by them. Is that in conformity with the philosophy of ethics in Islam?
Right.
I think that's.
So I want to note that you all of what I said today. I mean, you predicted in your chapter in the history and philosophy of Islamic science. There's a chapter in Islamic bioethics like 20 plus years ago you wrote, where you laid out this sort of the schism and the dichotomy and lack of holism. And so I appreciate that work, and I think that we haven't changed from that too much. I'll say that for the first part, there are three things. The first thing, that if the book launch and the people here are dying for practical stuff, there's another book that came out the year before this, Islamic Biomedicine. It's called Medicine Sharia, a dialogue on Islamic bioethics, which came out University of Notre Dame Press, which is my first edited volume, within which I have 4 4 or 5 chapters myself, which lays out some of what I prepared here, but also gives a sense of how you engage in the practical discourse, right? The Islamic biomedicine book is a little higher up of engagement of knowledge domains, although there's some practical there as well. But for practical, that medicine shared dialogue book, I think is very important for us to think about the practical discourse. Now, and that, by the way, has been well received within the Bioethics Academy, I'll say. At least they value it as something helpful for them to think about what Islamic thoughts might be, how their issues might be different, and it's topologies that weren't existing. So people have found that very valuable as bioethics teachers within the academy. All right. So how do I see this? And within why I brought that book is because within that book, when I wrote that book, and the editors, the reviewers came back with an ask of I add a new class of people who are putting out amazing things who perhaps would be very important in the discourse moving forward. And that class of people, in my book, I call them Muslim/Islamic bioethicists. And who are they? They're individuals who have gotten degrees in bioethics, whether they're PhD or a master's or clinical ethics fellowships, but they have been stamped by the Bioethics Academy, which is multivocal, multidisciplinary, pluralistic. And then now they've been in positions where they have to adjudicate matters in the existing medical care system and think about what their Islam has to say. And they're actively trying to bring in Islam in a way that's very practical. Not just about the Muslim patient or cultural competency, but really how can resources and frameworks from the Islamic world and thought processes be brought in? So one of the, for example, things they do is let's talk about qawaid fiqhiyah, right? We're not making fatwas, but there's a way of thinking about the problem, right? And the lawabit and qawaid that will help us then make our reasoning sharper and at least somewhat a source of Islam. Same thing as they bring in some notions of maqasid now. Everything has its limitations, but the point is that they want to update the reasoning process through the challenge at hand that has something more than just a scriptural verse, but not too far removed from Islam. And these are the individuals who are bringing that into their daily living, right? They're practicing as bioethicists, clinical committees members, or hadith ethics committees in Saudi or elsewhere, and they want to not divorce their practice from their traditional ways of thinking about, at least those both are fiqh-based, but they also want to bring in the philosophy of health and healing. So what does health mean? So they asked me to bring that in, and I thought, yeah, you're right. There's a new generation of people who are doing that. They themselves, as your question was, need some training and camaraderie and community. Otherwise, they'll be lost in the hinterlands, and perhaps they'll revert back to not knowing what to do. But they have to bring that in. So, for example, those larger concepts of health and healing, going back to, well, what did Ibn Sina say about health or the practice of medicine, right? We have chapters in Hindu's book, right? We have chapters of where they talk, here's what the practice of medicine is, here's what it deals with, here's how we think about it. Now, you might not take fatwas from Ibn Sina, but you at least have a very robust way of thinking about the body and the relationship with the doctor and the practice of medicine, which is wholly absent. You don't learn that professional anywhere. They're trying to bring that in. So that's my answer. They're initiatives, but those initiatives will die off without stability and rootedness in academies or institutions, right? How much can one person do? And when the profession pushes back. So let me give you an anecdote, if I might. Do you have time? I want to give you an anecdote in the middle of my career. 2 anecdotes actually that talk about this. So I told you as a medical student, the professor said, what does Islam have to say about that? I don't know. Let me figure it out. Okay. So now I thought maybe there's such a thing as Islamic bioethics. I read all the material. In the middle of my career, there were 2 very interesting incidences where I would be introduced oftentimes at talks, right? AASIM PADELA, or he's got degrees from these places. So I have the stamp of, yeah, I have a good lineage, right? But he also went to Oxford, studied Islamic. He's also Islamic. He says, he does Islamic bioethics. And when people say that in my medical academy, I would be thinking, is that either marginalization or is it saying specialization? Because where I'm sitting, there are no Muslims here, right? And I'm on the panel, and my token, that's Islamic bioethics, right? But I'm talking to you about organ transplantation. I'm talking about dying. Okay, I'm not talking about anything that we're not talking about. What does the Islamic there have to do? After this whole lineage of all the degrees, right? And I don't have a degree in Islam, by the way. So in any case, it would be interesting. So I would always wonder, and sometimes I felt that it was marginalization. And I remember that at one stage, I asked the question of, well, is there space in some of these panels for an Islamic response? And the idea was, well, the response from these people were like, you know, we are in the area of diversity and inclusion, and obviously Islam is there, but you have to check the Islam when we talk about medicine. Medicine is global, bioethics is global, right? And so this was the response when I would ask sometimes, and I remember asking a specific kind of question. Okay, part two. So I told you that I did some consultation, right? And so I was in the state in the United States of these abortion culture wars are still occurring. And I was asked to be an expert witness in a case about a new law on abortion that was coming in a certain state. I can say little things about this, but I can give you some vagaries. But that's the case. And they wanted me. Why me? Because all the other experts were of a Christian bent. And they felt, diversity and inclusion, that having a bioethicist who's not a Christian in the court would lend credence to what they're saying, because what they're saying is that this is not a Christian notion of abortion and conception, birth equals life. We're talking about how to help society. And the specific case was around fetal burial or remains, right? So the case was that when we have a miscarriage in the hospital, what do we do with those remains? Are the families allowed to take that remain and inter it or bury it, or do we just treat it as medical waste and incinerate it in the hospital? That was the question. And what is a bioethical response to that? Okay, and so they've gotten all these Christians to talk about the importance of of birth at conception, life at conception. They wanted me to write a commentary and then give the court case. To me, my response was, there are many ways you can give value to things. So when a woman is pregnant, does she give value to that thing within her body? Sometimes you name things before they're born. And when it's miscarried, does she think this is something, or she thinks this is waste? Like her, right? Is it something excess to be thrown away? What are the sociological data tell us about that? When we give respect to things, when we talk about dignity, do we give respect to things for what they might become? For example, do we give respect to biological material like eggs of certain types of animals? And we say they might become a full being, so we give the respect. So there's many ways to adjudicate respect. I'm not going to go through that whole essay. What happened was the following, which I think is very illuminating. So I wrote my essay, I have a deposition. I get to the court in front of the judge. And the way you get into speak, right? The first thing that happens in the court is that they have to tender you as an expert witness. So my CV, Dr. PADELA went here, did this, is on these advisory boards, has done this sort of work, has written these sorts of papers, is trained, so on and so forth. So they said, okay, we now tender Dr. PADELA with the qualifications of being able to be an expert witness in this case. Do you agree? The opposing side said, objection. Objection. Okay, I've never been in the court. This is in the middle of my career. I was very interested. Objection. I was thinking, well, what did they say? Because they went through my CV, all my degrees, all this stuff. What are they talking about? And he says, Dr. PADELA is not a qualified expert witness in this court because he is an Islamic bioethicist, and Islam has nothing to do with the way that we adjudicate law in the United States. And this court, with the separation of the First Amendment, cannot adjudicate on the basis of Islam. And therefore, he is not qualified to be an expert witness in this case. That is what that size. I thought immediately that was brilliant, but I emotionally, I didn't know what to do because you can't speak. So the judge sat there, and then I said, I don't know if I'm allowed to speak. Pardon me, and this is not in the record because the typist can't write anything. I'm not tendered. I can't. What I'm saying is nothing. It's not the case. I said, I don't know what we're trying to do here, but all the qualifications that I've gotten all these degrees like anybody else. All these other witnesses came forth, right? And they all have the same qualifications. I don't know, because I've written some papers on Islam that disqualifies me about speaking on this issue. They've seen I had a deposition and what I was talking about. I didn't bring anything in of Islam. And even so, I said all this, and I said that this seems to me to be not appropriate because of my Muslimness and my identity, that I don't have a voice in the American court system. Okay, that was an emotional response. I didn't think much about it. I said that. So the judge was in a quandary. So he said, we can keep his testimony as so long. If he says anything about Islam, then we will strike it, and then we will tender. So now I ask you. So I said, did whatever the rest of the stuff is there, the court case, things happen. You can look it up if you like. But my point was, so I wonder, right? Where is there a role for Islamic bioethics anywhere? Right? They were very brilliant in saying that I was a Islamic bioethicist, but then did I want to own that to speak on the court case about real matters? We're a pluralistic society where there's real issues here. Should we? I don't know what happens in Malaysia. Do you take that stuff and just burn it because it has no value? I mean, we're supposed to bury our nails in our hair. What about that? I don't know what happens in this country, this pluralistic. But my point was, to me, that's all about dignity, and respect for things that are human, that could have been human, and giving choice to people. Hey, I want to bury it. You can bury it. Why do I have to throw it in the incinerator? If you give it value, you gave it value when it was within you. Now it's outside of you. I mean, I've seen spontaneous abortions where a young girl. I'm an ER doctor, right? So 14 or 15 weeks, she has a miscarriage in my ER. This 15-year-old girl at this very early stage. What came out of her had like a head and hands. She said, non-Muslim, that's my baby. Can I take it home and bury it? She said this, not from 14, 15-year-old at this early stage. I thought this nothing to do with anybody taught her anything. She just noticed something that looked like her and she wanted to do something. Why can't we give people that right? That was my testimony. It was nothing on Islam, but that was a brilliant court case and the brilliant response by the judge. So
Yeah, that's great. Can we just take one last question? If the baby since morning, she wants to say something very brief so that we can, our Sheikh will be giving Jumu'ah khutbah today. Okay.
I think the issue has already been addressed. So I was wondering, for developing a systematic discourse on bioethics, it inevitably has to be a cooperative endeavor between people, experts who are trained in traditionally Islamic sciences, the Islamic jurists and scholars, and on the other hand, people who come from purely secular academic spaces. So I was wondering maybe if you have had some personal experience about the kind of communication that happens between two sets of experts who I presume lack a common vocabulary oftentimes. And do you see a potential for a constructive conversation between these two, or from the perspective of the integration of knowledge that we're talking about here, is there a need for a new type of an actor who will combine the knowledge of a sophisticated and specialized field like medicine and an expertise in classical Islamic sciences, which I presume is a difficult undertaking? But what are your thoughts about that?
So absolutely brilliant. So I think you're right in that book I mentioned already, Mr. Shriya. So that's about dialogue between two main actors, but there are others around there. So my entire academic career is about trying to build those bridges, right? Where we have theologians, scientists, social scientists, policymakers, right, and physicians come together and engage in dialogue to better understand the problem space again, and then generate a solution space, right, for that problem. Because we all see part of the whole, and we privilege certain types of data and knowledge and reasoning exercises over others. So that has been my sole enterprise, trying to do that. We had a working group, and so all the book that's coming out next week and the book that came out before, they're all have that sort of dialogue. Well, you see that there are theologians, classically trained, also academicians, all coming together to discuss issues. I'll give you the communication part is huge. So we had an 18-month, Professor Amar, who was here last week, he was in one of my first working groups. I mean, Allah bless him. And it was an 18-month working group. We had two high caliber theologian jurists. We had Sheikh Amar, who was an education scientist and trained. And we were talking about conceptions of risk, just conceptions of risk between science and Islam. Because just that term risk means various things, right? So I use risk. I think about science statistics to use risk, to adjudicate risk, right? We have tables, we have biomedical risk, right? And the way risk afterlife, salvation. How do I adjudicate there's an issue in salvation? I think about scriptural texts. There's a scientific body, how they think about what does risk mean, right? And so we had 18 months of dialogue once every 2 months just to get to be able to talk about that term, risk and harm, actually, so that we can understand each other, how we're thinking about it. Because when we now face a case, we can bring both disciplines, or more than two actually at that time, together to then solve, understand the problem, to the risks that are here and the harms that are here, to generate a solution. So those are the things that are needed, which is why I said that rootedness has to occur in multidisciplinary academies, without which you're at a solo enterprise in the hinterlands, and you need bridge builders who can have one foot here and there. I don't think mastery is possible, unfortunately, today, but at least literacy, right? So we can dialogue. And that probably is a good closing statement. Yeah. Okay. Jazakallah khair.
I think we should end the session because today's Friday, and for information, there's 80 attendees, all offline and online, and we have tons of questions. I think we can email them directly to Prof. So we thank Dr. Padela for his presentation today, and I should
Yeah, thank you very much indeed, Prof. This is really a great lecture. As I said in the beginning, I'd like to thank Dr. Ayn for moderating this. But brothers and sisters, what I wanted to conclude from what our professor has just mentioned, in fact, most of what he mentioned to us today should be the business of the people of Istac, the people of Islamic thought and civilization. And actually, that's the purpose why we invited our scholar to put all these big questions to us here, so that we understand that if we are in Islamic thought and civilization, these are the issues we should address. This is how Islamic thought or Islam be related to the world, to what's happening in the world. Otherwise, we are out of history, out of civilization. We are just living here as any other group. As Ibn Khaldun say, we are not in the stage of Umran, Bashari. We are post-Umran. So these are the real questions that our philosophers, our people of Islamic thought need to address. This is a very transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary area where we want to see Muslim scholars. I'm not talking about the fiqh specific approach. That one also another big situation we need to address. And to me, what we discussed here is just actually the iceberg, the outside, the appearance thing. If you want to understand why this articulation is in this way, and many other issues we articulate this way, because the deep issue is actually the educational system. The educational system. How do we build a medical doctor? How do we build a faqih? Who is a faqih in our perspective in 21st century? What knowledge he needs, what attitudes he needs, what skills he needs. If his all skills is just to memorize and master Al-Shafi'i, Al-Ghazali, Al-Sukir, Waliullah Dahlawi, and all this, Shatibi and all, but cannot articulate and relate and answer these questions, not as a master of bioethics or medical doctor, but a person who knows. You are talking about Islam. Islam is a universal text. Islam is a universal knowledge. Islam is a universal ilm. Rahmatan lil alameen. Islam is mostly about universals. The particular is for you in your Muslim society. But Islam mostly is about humanity, about human. When you talk about, for example, bioethics, we, as Prof mentioned rightly, we have to talk about the human. We talk about in Islam we call siha or al-afiyah, siha. But what is siha? What is health in Islam? Why Rasulullah says there are two things where most of the humanity of the people are maghboon, are very, really lost. And what is it? The first one is a siha, health. But what is that health? From a worldview of Islam, it is a siha al-jasadiyya, means the body, the jasad, siha. And then the most important siha is other siha, which is a siha al-aqliyya, a siha al-nafsiyya, الصحة الأخلاقية, الصحة الاجتماعية. So how do we articulate this concept of Islam, of shifa, or siha, or afia, or in our educational system to train the doctor of today, the faqih of today, the usuli of today. So I think, and actually, the educational system, that's why we're talking Islamization, about dichotomy, about split, about Muslim crisis in the Muslim mind. We talk about this is really important so that we can create that philosophy of bioethics. There we start all our works, because in the West today, they are very sophisticated in all this. When it comes to the technicalities and the practice, the details there, if you take all your life as a student, you cannot master them in your 70 years old. But the issue is not there. The issue is, from our perspective, is that philosophy and how we articulate it into the education of the doctor, into the education of the faqih. And then you go, I think our baby one talks about the whether they collaborate or not. That's also another big issue in the majami' al-fiqh and the majami' of this, the majami' of this. You spend a lot of times in this. So I think we need to articulate the bigger picture, the educational system, and from the educational system, we move to the cultural system. That's another issue in dealing with these bioethical things. And then we articulate how Islam is universal. Then we will not only talk about, we don't need to use the word or the term Islamic. You talk about the human. And this human is Khalifa on earth. Khalifa Muslim, Khalifa non-Muslim. From there, you build all your new dictionary of bioethics down to the application. So, Sheikh, you have given us a great knowledge today. I hope our postgraduate student, these are the issues we take. We will create under Istac here. I already talked to Dr. Ahmed Al-Muhammadi, research team here, multidisciplinary research team on these things. Philosophy, ethics, bioethics, artificial intelligence. We need our ulama, our scholars, our philosophers to come very to the fore of what's happening. So once again, I would like to thank our professor for the great lecture, our people who are here, our professors, our students, and the great people who are in the Zoom there and the YouTube. More than 60 people who are following from many countries, from Tanja to Jakarta, Washington to Moscow. So this is something great, even though the announcement was very just recently, but Alhamdulillah, Prof, we will make sure that we get you in other venue to give your knowledge, your ilm. We learned a lot today. We end our session today by reading Surah Al-Asr, and then we will give a souvenir to our professor. And inshallah, we will go for our lunch here. Those virtual, they can have virtual lunch. And our professor will be delivering khutbah Jumu'ah here at Istac. This is another great thing today. Maybe he will talk about bioethics also. With this, I thank you all. May God bless you. And we end by reading Surah Al-Asr, inshallah. Thank you very much. Let's give a presentation.